Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Thank you, Gertrude. My name is Juliet Pawlak. I'm based in Melbourne, Southeast Melbourne, and I'm coming today to share my story with you. My background, I was born in Sri Lanka, in northern part of Sri Lanka, in a town called Jaffna, and have lived across multiple continents. I, at a very young age, so grew up talking Tamil, which is a minority language in Sri Lanka, and moved to Saudi Arabia for a couple of years as part of my dad's expat post. And then moved to Australia, or Sydney particularly, to start my schooling years from the age of 7. So I grew up in a very strict, conservative household, Christian household, but we were escaping the civil war in northern Sri Lanka. And as part of that, my family, particularly my parents, were extremely focused on us holding on to our culture, our language, our community, because we came from a town which was very much about the village. Everyone knew each other, everyone was related to each other, and we lived in each other's houses. So when we moved to a foreign country, which is Australia, my parents were very keen for us to hold on to that culture. So my experience growing up as a woman of color, interestingly, I saw myself as a Sri Lankan Tamil living in Australia. I went through that journey. I went to a school which was made up of other cultures, and then was moved into a school where there was primarily Sri Lankan Tamil children. So, I felt like I was continuing to be part of my tribe and part of the people. And we had a very large extended family. So weekends and holidays were all about family. And then when I grew up and went to university, that's when I realized my Tamil name. So I've got Juliet is my Christian name, Ramya is my Tamil name. And I found when I went to university, people were struggling to pronounce my middle name. And it used to frustrate me because I used to be able to say it's Ramya, and I used to get called different things unintentionally by new friends who are not from my culture. So I consciously made that decision at that point to start using my Christian name because it was easier for people to pronounce my name. So I then, went through that experience. I, like I said, identified as Australian, but also Tamil, very proud of my culture. But it was only when I moved into, and then I got, got married then to someone who was from my culture. And then for various reasons, and that was at a very young age. And then and a lot of that was because of cultural expectations around what I was expected to do, who I was meant to marry. And then met my current husband, who's of Australian Anglo-Saxon descent. So it's really interesting that I recently had the opportunity of talking at the Australian Professionals of Colour panel event. And throughout my time, because a long part of my career has been in human resources, so I studied psychology at university, really interested in anthropology and cultures, how people tick. A big part of what I'm passionate about is food, fashion, but also travel. And I've traveled over 50 countries in my time. And my love of anthropology, culture, archaeology has been something that I've held ever since I was at university. And when I did psychology, I did those as part of my degree. And it's something that I've held with me because I moved with my husband to the UK, had the pleasure of traveling, meeting lots of different cultures. But the thing that really stood out for me when I moved to the UK, when I used to proudly say I'm Australian, was, wow, don't you come from a country? And I found their own experiences being incredibly racist, and that I came from a country that was incredibly biased. That was at the age of 25, was probably the first time I stepped back, was taken aback by the perception of the country that I was really proud of growing up in, country that had actually been salvaged from my family and I in escaping Sri Lanka, but also where I've had so much opportunity. So that was probably my first opportunity in stepping back and seeing Australia and the culture of bias that other countries perceived. And I was quite taken aback. My husband had very similar experience. So both of us took us a little bit of time to step back and go, actually, that's really interesting. We hadn't seen it that way. But when we dug deeper, there were examples of things where, having lived in South Australia, in Adelaide, and being the only woman of colour, I was often referred to as very exotic. I was referred to as various things, which at that time I thought was a compliment. But now stepping back and went, that was because I stood out from those that were from the town that I was living in. So I think, some of my biggest learnings have really been, as I've navigated through my career, I've faced a number of challenges, which, I'll talk about, but particularly as a woman of color who has had certain expectations put on me around excelling and being great at what I do. But then overlaying that with societal and cultural expectations as well, around being a mother, being married, being what that looks like in terms of looking after my home, how that competes in terms of me being a primary breadwinner at home as well, and how that plays out, which is different to how my culture has perceived the role of women. But also in terms of the many biases that I have faced, advancing through the corporate ladder over 25 odd years. It's only more recently, whilst I've started working in the inclusion and diversity space, particularly starting to have conversations with women of colour around the bias that they've faced, that I've stepped back and looked at my own mirror of experience, a lot of which I've actually either not stepped back and acknowledged or actually realised was a challenge until I faced into it as part of my preparation for this recent panel event. And I keep saying to those around me, I feel like a part of me has woken through this process because, and I have now started being very clear around the role that I play, and also calling out bias, which is, a lot of it's been through maturity and confidence, which I certainly didn't have 20 odd years ago when I joined the workforce, but also just as in my day-to-day life, being a role model for my own children, who are of mixed race, but also growing up in a different generation who seems to be far more inclusive than maybe the culture that I have come from, but also the lived experience that I've come from. And going from Sydney to Adelaide to the UK, back to Sydney, and now Melbourne. Melbourne is home. I can say that my experiences have really shaped me. But also it's also made me be really thankful for the many allies and sponsors I've had in my life, both within personally as well as within my personal life as well. but also more importantly, what I've learned about myself around my own biases, and how that shows up. But actually being, comfortable to talk about that. So that's been a big part of my experience. I've really enjoyed meeting particularly women of color who've reached out, who's asked me to be their mentor, share my own stories around how I've navigated that. I've often stepped back and wondered, what is it that I have that's valuable? But interestingly, when I articulate my story, and I do a lot of my sharing through storytelling, has really seemed to resonate a chord with lots of other women who either haven't grown up here or have come to Australia with quite high levels of education, but been really struggling to be able to make a place for themselves. So from that perspective, I feel very privileged that my network and my allyship is growing, but also that through my own personal work, but also through my LinkedIn posts and conversation I'm having, that in some way that I can help others overcome some of the things that I've had to overcome in my many years working, particularly in corporates, but also growing up as a woman of color in Australia, which has been a big part of my experience. So I think for me, it's really exciting to be here. I think, anything that I can do to give back, and I think that's probably my biggest piece, is what can I do to give back in terms of either my career or my personal lived experience, as I think about the ongoing impact I want to have in people's lives. And I feel like in Australia, looking at the inclusion and diversity agenda, having worked in this space, we need to move beyond gender. Gender equality is important. That's something we need to have as a minimum, given that there's 54% of women across Australia. But the women of colour piece is the accelerant. It's the piece that really gives us the true diversity at the table, and both within the work context, but also in terms of the role that we play as caregivers and housemakers. What does that look like in the way that we show up at home, which is really important. So in terms of why I'm here, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you, Gertrude, for the opportunity.
The pleasure's all mine, Juliet. What a fascinating life you've had up until this point. So, how do you integrate DEI principles into the fabric of an organization's culture, especially when working in large and complex organizations?
Yeah. I think for me, in my experience, inclusion and diversity can't be successful if it's a role or an individual sitting out on the side, which is where sadly I've seen a lot of large organizations. Where I've seen it be really successful is to have the most senior leaders, including the CEO, owning and being passionate about inclusion and diversity. And it starts with targets or commitments, because that what gets measured gets done. But then it needs to be woven into every single people manager's role around their accountability. And it needs to be integrated into the fabric of all the people policies, the processes, the decisions you make when you go out to recruit, the way that you mobilize and move people around, the way you promote people, the way you teach them new skills and learning. And so for me, it needs to be woven into the fabric, which is why I see some organizations struggle with that, because inclusion and diversity as a concept is growing and morphing, and sometimes it's moving faster than the systems that we already have in place.
Yeah, that's so true. That is so true. So, can you share some insights into how you approach the definition and execution of DEI strategies in diverse sectors and geographical regions?
Yeah, so for me, it starts with metrics. So when I say metrics, it's understanding, what's the makeup of the organization, what does that look like, not just from a gender perspective, but intersectional, LGBTIQ, First Peoples, accessibility. So typically organizations would have some core pillars that they focus on, and it's looking at those metrics, looking at the trend of those metrics, looking at engagement or feedback because there's only so much you can glean from data. You need to also go out and talk to people and understand their lived experience, but also speak to allies in the organizations, because sometimes if you go and interview people and ask them a set of questions, they often may only feel comfortable showing the positive side of the story. So you need to be able to uncover the root cause and challenges that people have, and to be able to then turn that into a way of how we then move forward. And I think what I've experienced is sometimes inclusion diversity, because it is so complex, diverse, multimodal, it becomes so big and so large. My biggest experience is chunk it down into small things that are doable. But the biggest way is to have allies in the organization. You need to have business leaders and champions. You can't do this as a group of one or two individuals, which is what's been my experience in every organization I've worked in.
In your role, how do you foster a sense of inclusion and belonging amongst employees? And what impact does this have on the organization's performance?
Yeah. So for me, I lead a diverse portfolio within the people and culture function. So I have about 90% of the function that reports through to me, and my title is Head of Performance and Inclusion. And I was really proud of signing up for this role because inclusion was part of my remit. Now, how that plays out for me is really understanding each of my team members at an individual level. What drives them? What are their bias? What are the things they struggle with? Through that process, what I've also reflected on are what are my own personal biases as a leader? Because when that shows up, it allows me to be an empathetic leader, but also helps me support my team, either get the right career opportunities, get the right feedback when they need the right feedback, or how do I support them in where they need to go? And for me, a big part of that is role modeling that behavior within my own team, recognition, reward, but also just understanding each other better, both at an individual level and then at a team level. And then for me, it's how do I then show up in the way that I lead the team, either through one-on-one or as a team. And that for me is a big part of what I then expect of my leaders. And then when we start to go into developing programs from a HR perspective around learning, induction, that's what I use as a basis of what good looks like.
So what are some of the most significant challenges that you faced in implementing DEI initiatives, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah. So one of my recent employers, I was asked to define a gender strategy, which I did. And it was a human-centered design approach. So I went out and interviewed 52 people, went away and looked at all the initiatives that work, the things that aren't working, and what's then a roadmap. My challenge that I was given is once I defined that, it was about 14 different streams with multiple activities. Sadly, I wasn't given any budget and I wasn't given any resourcing to make it happen. So my challenge in how I brought that to life, because I've been an individual contributor and worked in large matrix organizations, was build my allies across P&C who owned different portfolios, so leadership, talent, recruitment, learning and development, the business partnering team. Then I also ensured that I had the executive sponsors around the table that understood the strategy, then worked with some senior leaders across the business. And I built my own network of influencers and used that. And through that, I had people come up out of the woodwork to help to volunteer their time to be my program manager. My governance offered their own time free of charge. I was given budgets because of the relationships I built. It was hard work, but we managed to lift gender representation by 1% in 12 months because of the dedication, but it was an exhausting 12 months because of that challenge.
I can imagine, but it sounds like you were up to the challenge.
Yeah, definitely.
So how do you influence and drive leadership to actively participate in and champion DEI initiatives?
I think for me, it's going back to my point around if you don't have your senior stakeholders sitting at the most senior level of the organization, understanding the WIFM. So for me, the WIFM is what's in it for me? What is the individual driver for each executive to value diversity, especially if, in my experience, a lot of senior leaders are from a homogenous group or from a particular gender. it makes it very hard for them to understand lived experience of those that are not around them. So I've partnered with diversity and inclusion providers who are great at coming in and doing either 360s or really doing a in-depth survey and feedback on where execs are at in terms of their own bias, but also giving them feedback around inclusion. So that mirror opportunity needs to happen, but it's not a space that a lot of execs feel comfortable in because of what that might show up around their own opportunities. But that's where I found the most is the execs that lean into that, realize that they don't know much about inclusion diversity, that they have their own biases but want to change. And when you have that group effect led by the CEO, that's when you start to see some change.
So what advice would you give to HR and DEI professionals who are just starting out and looking to make a significant impact in their own organizations?
I would say expand your networks, both within the organization but externally. There are people like yourself, Gertrude. There are a lot of passionate people that know deeply about inclusion and the different pillars of inclusion, but also the challenges. I think it's building those connections and networks makes you realize this is a shared problem, shared opportunity. You're not solving this on your own shoulders because it can become very daunting as someone who's carrying the mantle of solving inclusion and belonging or inclusion and diversity in an organization for 5,000-6,000. You need to build your networks because this needs to be a shared opportunity, but that needs to happen not just within your organization, but across your external to the organization or external to sector even.
That's so good. So throughout your 25 years of experience, how has your approach to DEI evolved, and what key learnings have you gained and can you share?
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of things. One was my own sort of mirror awareness around being aware of my own biases. So I was been through a couple of training sessions where there were some surveys and measures around biases. And it was almost like a truth-telling session where sometimes, I used to go, well, I'm a woman of color. I've had X, Y, and Z things happen to me. These are the challenges. So woe is me. When actually stepping back and going, I am one small person who has, yes, some challenges, but actually I'm not unique. There are much broader people out there with different perspectives and different challenges. So I think for me, it's actually putting myself in those shoes of those that are not like me, who've got, which then also then introduced me the concept of privilege. Because when I step back and I the privileges that I have, which then talk to the privilege people don't have, made me realize around what I could do in this space.
Fantastic. Thank you. So really wonderful to have met you, Juliet. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in. I will be back again tomorrow with yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And bye for now. Thanks again, Juliet.
Thank you, Gertrude.
And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely